You know, for nearly half a century, the entire world lived under the shadow of a conflict that was unlike anything before it. We're talking about a 45-year global struggle that pitted two superpowers against each other and brought humanity right to the brink of annihilation. And the craziest part? It all happened without a single, direct declaration of war.
What's really interesting is that the name Cold War actually came about before the conflict really got started. The writer George Orwell, back in 1945, used it to describe this new reality of living under the threat of nuclear weapons, a permanent state of hostility, but without any active, hot fighting. And man, did that perfectly describe the era that was about to unfold.
So what was the Cold War, really? Well, at its core, it was this incredibly intense rivalry, geopolitical, ideological, you name it, between the capitalist United States and the communist Soviet Union. But here's the key thing to remember. While they were constantly competing for influence all over the globe, their own armies never actually fought each other on a large scale. And that's what made it such a uniquely tense and dangerous time in history.
To really get this, you have to go back to the ashes of World War II, the alliance between the US and the Soviet Union, which had been so important to winning the war, just completely fell apart. That trust was replaced by suspicion, and pretty soon, the entire globe was split into two heavily armed opposing camps.
And the division was just stark. On one side, you had the Western Bloc, led by the United States. Their whole thing was capitalism and democracy, and they were all unified under the NATO military alliance. Then, on the other side, you had the Eastern Bloc, led by the Soviet Union, bound together by communism and their own alliance, the Warsaw Pact. This wasn't just about politics. It was a fundamental clash of how they thought the world should work.
And nobody, nobody, captured this new reality more powerfully than Winston Churchill. In 1946, he gave this famous speech where he declared that an iron curtain had fallen across Europe. And look, that wasn't just a clever phrase. It represented a very real, very physical barrier, a political and ideological wall that was separating the Soviet-controlled East from the West. So, if they weren't fighting directly, how did this war even work? Well, with direct confrontation between two nuclear powers being way too catastrophic to even think about, the Cold War became this global shadow war. It was fought using indirect and often very secretive methods.
The superpowers basically fought it out on four main fronts. Yet espionage, this constant hidden game of spies between the CIA and the KGB. Then there was the arms race, a terrifyingly relentless buildup of nuclear weapons. They fought proxy wars, which meant funding and arming opposite sides in conflicts all over the world. And they even took their rivalry to the stars, in the space race.
Now that term Cold War, it can be a little misleading, right? Because for countries like Korea or Vietnam or Afghanistan, this conflict was anything but cold. It was devastatingly hot. These proxy wars were actual battlefields where millions of people died, all while the United States and the Soviet Union used these smaller nations as stand-ins for their own global fight.
And yeah, even the final frontier became a battleground for bragging rights. When the Soviets launched Sputnik 1 in 1957, it sent a shockwave through the West. But then, when the Americans landed on the moon in 1969, it was seen as this huge technological and ideological victory for capitalism, and it was broadcast for the entire world to see.
But you know, all this competition, it had a really, really dark side. This relentless arms race pushed the world closer and closer to the edge of total nuclear annihilation. It was a time when the fate of humanity really did hang in the balance.
The scale of this threat, honestly, it's hard to even wrap your head around. Declassified U.S. plans from the late 50s revealed this strategy of massive retaliation. So what did that mean? It meant the systematic destruction of every single major city in the Soviet bloc and China. We're talking Moscow, Beijing, all of them. The number of targets on that list? 1,200. Just let that sink in. That was the reality of living on the nuclear brink.
And the moment the world came closest to all-out disaster was October 1962. It all started when the U.S. discovered that the Soviets had placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just a few miles off the coast of Florida. What followed was a super tense 13-day standoff. For 13 days, the entire planet just held its breath. Thankfully, through some secret back-channel negotiations and a naval blockade, war was avoided at the last second. That was the moment the Cold War almost went very, very hot.
For decades, it just seemed like this divided world was permanent. This was just how things were. But then, in the late 1980s, driven by a failing economy and this deep, powerful desire for freedom,
the foundation of the Soviet Empire started to crack, and then it just began to crumble.
And this famous challenge from U.S. President Ronald Reagan in 1987, it really captured the feeling at the time. He was standing at the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin, and he just laid it out there. The Berlin Wall was the most powerful symbol of that Iron Curtain, and the calls to get rid of it were just getting louder and louder.
And then, the end came so fast. The Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, he introduced these reforms, glasnost, which means openness, and perestroika, restructuring, because he was trying to save a failing system. But what he did was unintentionally open the floodgates. Once people got a taste of freedom, they wanted the whole thing. By 1989, you had these popular revolutions toppling communist governments all across Eastern Europe, which led to the historic fall of the Berlin Wall. And just 2 years after that, the Soviet Union itself was gone.
So, in just a few short years, the entire global map was completely redrawn. The 45-year struggle was over. The Warsaw Pact didn't exist anymore. The Soviet Union had dissolved, and the United States was left standing as the world's one and only superpower.
So yeah, the Cold War officially ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union more than 3 decades ago. But when you look at the world today, with all the rising tensions and these new spheres of influence forming, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? Was it a definitive end, or was it just a pause in a much longer rivalry between great powers?